A man chooses, a slave obeys.
Welcome to the Ethics in Video Games podcast, where we explore issues at the intersection of ethics and video games.
What follows is a series of graphic, interactive scenes that we can't show you.
All right, welcome everybody. We're here with Dr. Mark R. Johnson, lecturer in digital cultures in the Department of Media and Communications at the University of Sydney. I think, Mark, you are our Aussie number 6, maybe? Because, you know, you guys are so overrepresented in our podcast. We love you guys. His research focuses on game live streaming and Twitch TV, esports, gamification, and gamblification, which is what we're going to talk about today. He's published in journals including Information Communication Society, New Media and Society, Media Culture and Society, Convergence and Games and Culture. Outside academia, he's also an independent game designer, best known for the roguelike Ultima Ratio Regum. He's also a regular games blogger and very usefully for this episode, former professional online poker player. All right. Mark Johnson, welcome to the show.
Thanks, guys. It's great to be here.
All right, so to get right to it, we're going to divide our conversation into two parts because, frankly, there's just a lot to talk about. So first, we're going to talk about gamblification in video games, and then we'll talk about gambling on video games. Right? So when we're talking about gamblification of video games, or in video games, I guess, what sort of mechanics are we talking about?
I think there's quite a range of things that count in this. I think the biggest one which people tend to talk about are loot boxes, which of course are kind of in-game items which you pay real world money for, and there's some in-game items inside these boxes and you don't quite know what they are, and you pay real world money, and then you open the box and then maybe you get something good, something useful, or something which is not that useful. Maybe the stuff you get based on which game you're playing might be kind of gameplay type stuff or cosmetic stuff or some mix of those things. I think that's the kind of biggest one. I think it's both, I think, the most common in terms of how much it's used, in terms of how many people are playing games where it's used, in terms of how much kind of public or policy interest it's kind of captured or gathered. I think loot boxes come first, particularly in games like Star Wars Battlefront 2 and things of this sort. Like, loot boxes got a lot of sort of public attention and public opprobrium. But there's also others, like one is what's called skin betting or skin gambling, which is kind of wagering on cosmetic appearances for things like your character or your gun in a game or things of this sort.
Mm-hmm. Can you explain that one? So we're not gambling. How's that supposed to work? Yeah.
A lot of these skins are seen as having real world money value, and on various kinds of sites and platforms and things of this sort, you can wager these and bet these, in some cases on kind of classic casino games like roulette or things of that sort, or in other cases on kind of custom made sort kind of gambling styles. Yeah.
So how do they decide what they're worth?
That's a whole range of things. That can come down to kind of what the game devs think that item's worth, what players think it's worth, how much it trades for, how many of that item exist, while kind of keeping in mind none of these items exist in a physical sense, of course.
Right. They're all virtual items. So.
Yeah. So kind of a mix of those things tends to shape kind of how much they are worth and how much they are valued at. And there's kind of marketplaces on various sites which kind of have these prices which go up and down and change with time and so on. Yeah.
It seems to me there's a lot of ways this could work, but are we talking about, I'm going to take the skin, let's say the skin or the item that I have, you're going to value it as being worth X, and then I could gamble with that and potentially get more?
Yeah. And if one takes a look at these sorts of channels on Twitch or on YouTube, some of these are very high stakes forms of play. Some of these skins are worth a lot of money, or are perceived as being worth a lot anyway.
When you
Right.
say a lot, what are we talking about? What's the top range here?
I should have looked that up before I came on this podcast.
Tens of thousands of dollars, right?
Yeah,
In the tens of thousands of dollars.
These are not part of the game. This is essentially something that would go on a Twitch, or are the games that actually incorporate that as a part of the game?
It depends on the game. Some games have kind of a closer integration between this and the game itself, while on others it's far more kind of grey market type sites where this takes place. It varies based on the game, based on what platform that game's on, based on kind of what that game's developers are trying to create or build. So there's quite a range of these things, I think.
Do you have an example you could reach for where this is actually in a game?
I think Counter-Strike is quite a good example.
Yep.
There's a lot of kind of connection there of trading these things at least and buying these things, and the wagering side has some connections to the game itself, and I think that's also quite a well-known one as well. And there's plenty of streams, like I say, on both Twitch and YouTube where you can watch people like trying to get good skins, or trying to trade good skins, or trying to gamble good skins for other
That's
skins,
right.
and that type of stuff. Yeah.
We actually had a student a few years back who hosted a Counter-Strike trading site
Okay.
where
yeah,
it was
interesting.
basically he ran a server and had a special level that he had built that ran on the Counter-Strike engine, and players could come there and basically trade virtual items on his site, and he got a cut.
Right. Though, notice, right? I mean, you're just setting a marketplace where people voluntarily trade.
But because he was also building he was actually building the level that they were in, because they were in a virtual level that was basically a Counter-Strike world. He could actually build other things into that. He could have, and he hadn't, and maybe he has by now, I don't know, and built in some, games that people play and, and wager on. And you could totally put it in there, yeah.
Yeah. Like, I think sort of there's a spectrum of these things, from kind of loads of games now you can spend money to buy a skin, and then in some portion of those games you can trade those, and then in some portion of those games you can wager them as well. So it's a kind of spectrum of these things, I think. Yeah.
It seems to me that there's a kind of a big difference between the, trade them or even sell them and wager them, because wagering them obviously seems like you really need a set price for something.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, I mean, I know you said this is a combination of what people think are worth for it, what things are worth, what the house is worth. Are we wagering in the sense of, I imagine, let's say we're playing somehow a one-on-one Counter-Strike. I know there's no one-on-one Counter-Strike, but let's say we are playing like a one-on-one Counter-Strike game, right? And we're both wagering our skin, right? Our skins. Notice that's an easy kind of way where you can say there's voluntary agreement. Both people, acknowledge that it's worth it. But how does it, more specifically, how does it work? How do we know if there's any sort of fair accounting of what my skin is worth? And Andy's like smiling at me right now.
Well, right. I'm thinking a couple of things. First off, it's like we've seen this scene a million times in westerns, right? They're in the saloon. The one guy's run out of money, and he's looking around for something that he can throw in the pot.
Right.
And everybody else just has to agree that just covers the bet. Right. Whatever it is.
Mark,
they'll
is that
either say
how
yes
it
or no.
works?
It doesn't.
I mean,
Are you betting against other people or the house?
Yeah, depends on the site or platform or so on. I think in terms of establishing this site, I think like most sites will have links to some kind of marketplace where these prices kind of settle down on some level. Other sites, like I say, will have some kind of centralized sense of what each of these things is worth. But I do believe that different sites or platforms or places where you can do this will, to some extent, have different values for items, at least to some extent. And I think for some of them, kind of like a poker site would have a kind of deposit bonus or something like this, where like every X thousand hands you play, you get $10 back, that type of thing. I think some of the skin sites kind of promote themselves based on having slightly superior odds or slightly kinder prices for the player, that type of stuff. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, interesting. Okay, so besides this, what other game elements would you count as gamblified?
Yeah, so outside of loot boxes and skin betting, you could also argue that to some extent things like battle passes are kind of quasi-gamblified. So this would be games where like every match of a MOBA you play, you get some items at the end of it. If you pay for a battle pass, which is let's say $40 a month or something, then the items you get at the end of each match are then randomized to be better on average than they would be if you hadn't paid for the battle pass. And that's a kind of intriguing model because since it's sort of like, imagine if kind of playing a slot machine was free, and you did have some chance of like big wins, but it was extremely small. But if you paid a monthly subscription to the slot machine, then your odds of something good get better, which is a kind of intriguing model and not kind of something we really see in traditional casinos or traditional gambling sites. There's not a good comparison here.
That's closer to the pay to win sort of situations, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Some games have that sort of model. Dan Joseph wrote a great paper on this a few years back called Battle Pass Capitalism. And for those who are watching, I encourage you to seek out that paper. Yeah, so that's another model which is kind of right on that border of kind of, is this a gamblified thing? Is this not? Personally, I think it is, but it's on the lighter side, in air quotes, on this kind of gambling spectrum, but that exists too. And then there's also things like esports betting, which is in essence just normal sports betting, except for esports rather than for traditional physical sports. And that's quite a big thing now as well.
Right, but by the time we get to that though, we're no longer in games now. In
general, yeah. I don't know offhand of any game where real world betting has been integrated into the game platform itself yet. I might be wrong on that, but I can't bring one to mind. I think most of that is on like William Hill or Ladbrokes or those sorts of sites. Yeah,
it's interesting that you point out that you don't know if any game has actually integrated actual gambling.
I don't think so, and I hope I'm not kind of embarrassing myself live on air here, but I can't think of any sort of esports type game where you can place money on the outcomes of matches, and you do that placing inside the game app itself. Yeah, I can't think of
I don't think that's. I can't think of any offhand either.
Would that fall under like legal restrictions on sports betting that would make things complicated?
In general, yes. I recently published a piece on this with Bretta Barbanel from UNLV, where we found that esports viewers are not particularly savvy when it comes to sports betting type stuff, which is maybe not a huge shock, I think, seeing as they're coming from a games background rather than from a sports background. Most esports fans are not particularly savvy about how sports betting works and how like lines are made and all this type of stuff. So yes, but I don't think most people are kind of fully aware of what those factors are and what those complications are and how that might play out in practice, I think.
Now, is it the same people though isn't it sports betting that wants to bet on esports?
I think probably not. I think in most cases, yeah.
Really?
It's we are seeing some traditional betting sites now doing esports betting, but there's also kind of esports betting specific betting websites now as well.
Okay.
Some of those sit in that kind of gray area that some of the old poker sites did, where like your level of protection as a player is middling, and for those who are doing sound only, I'm kind of waving my hand
yes.
ambiguously right now. Yeah, a few sites sit in that kind of grey market space, I think, but some seem to be more legit. A lot of these sites also are linked to like Web3 and crypto type stuff as well.
Yep.
It's interesting. My brother-in-law is a sports gambler. It takes years to focus on the math involved.
Yes.
And it's interesting. I mean, you would think that when it comes to games, everything is quantified. And what gamblers really want is, the really high end ones that, he does quite well. He's like a math genius. That you think from esport, you can get so much data that would give you exactly the kind of thing that sports gamblers would want.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that is the thing which kind of marks out things like poker or things like sports betting, if it's your job, from just like playing slots or these sorts of things, where there's a lot of mathematics involved, there's a lot of psychology involved, more on the poker side for that one than the sports betting side, but still. Whereas esports, the volume of data points you've got in esports can be vastly beyond any physical sport that exists by far, of course, because every inch of data is stored in an esports match, of course. So I do think that changes things, and I don't know whether there are people right now making a full-time living on esports betting. With that said, though, having spent 3 years of my life around poker players, I wouldn't be shocked if there are people doing this already as a full-time job. Like, these sorts of people are very resourceful and very fast at jumping on the next thing where there's some edge for the thinking strategic better. Yeah.
Right. Well, this is where I tell a story about my dad teaching me how to gamble at on horses. On horse racing. He said, you don't go in the middle of the week because that's the only people there are the professional gamblers. You go on the weekend because you don't have to be smarter than you don't have to be smarter than the horses. You just have to be smarter than most everybody around you.
Right. And when it comes to esports, as you said, most people are not necessarily, on that level.
Not very savvy about these sorts of things, right?
Then again, how many people bet on the Red Sox or something, right? Just you bet on your team, right? Yeah,
right.
Yeah. Like, I think sort of it's one of those things where the same game can be played by people, but what those people are doing and the chance of success can be very distinctive. In that, for 99%, let's say, of people, playing poker is the same as playing slots. In essence, you will be a long-term loser across a large sample size.
Right.
It doesn't kind of matter a great deal what one is doing. One will still be a kind of long-term loser. And like in my own life, for instance, I don't think I've ever placed a bet on anything in my life outside of poker, precisely because poker's a long-term skill game and other things for me or for everybody are not.
Right.
And so those sorts of aspects, I think, are important to keep in mind here, where I think esports betting is going to appeal to far more people than can possibly make any money from it, as is the case for all gambling forms and so on.
That's right. The people who go to the horse races on weekends, they just want to watch horses run around and once in a while collect $10.
And it's fun. Yeah,
and it's fun.
Okay, so are there games that are, very similar to just slot machines, where it's a video game, but at the end of the day, you're gambling, and it's a thinly veiled video game?
Well, there are actual slot machine games.
Right. So this is, I guess what I'm asking is, how blurred have the lines become between traditional gamings and what we would call, video games that have incorporated gambling elements like the slot machine?
Yeah. I mean, on the slots first, there's now kind of slot machines which are based on games, and it's hard to pin down how appealing these are. I haven't heard of these having a huge amount of success in most markets. Again, I think the demographic of someone who goes to a casino to sit down in front of slots for 6 hours is generally not the same demographic of someone who enjoys playing Resident Evil on their PlayStation or something. Anyway, I think for the bigger question, I think the kind of headline takeaway is, I think we have to split games into what kinds of games are we talking about becoming gamblified, in the sense of, if we're talking about blockbuster games or mobile games or indie games as kind of three sort of high level groups, I think we might look at here.
Yeah, what's the difference?
In terms of blockbuster games, so like games with huge budgets, huge player bases, made by huge studios and so on. In blockbuster games, gamblification is becoming, it's not ubiquitous yet or anything close to it, but it's becoming significant, I'd say, in blockbuster games. in mobile games, I'd say fairly close to blockbuster games. Again, it's nowhere near ubiquitous, but a lot of mobile games do use these kind of loot boxy style methods, or kind of lightly gamblified options where you pay money and the outcome is not completely known. But then indie games, it's basically completely unknown. I would struggle to find any indie game ever released, to be honest, which uses any kind of gambling style monetization method. And there's quite a strong kind of cultural push in the indie games, or kind of smaller in air quotes games space, away from these sorts of systems. I think a lot of people in that more kind of artistic creative space see this as being a very nasty way to monetize games. They see this as being something which is or could be exploitative, and something which, and they're right in this, something which inevitably transforms the design of the game you're making. As if the game is trying to make money from getting people to do microtransactions or loot boxes and so on, that has to be a part of the game's broader design, and that then shapes what kind of game you are making towards a game which will encourage people to buy these things and to engage with these things. So I think there's an artistic creative aspect, and there's also a moral aspect in the indie games world, which has kept that away from loot boxes and so on. Whereas for blockbuster companies and mobile game companies, I'm not making a sweeping statement here, and I'm making no moral judgments on anyone. But with that said, these tend to be sectors which are a little bit less concerned about artistic and creative integrity or fulfillment or artistic practice than the indie game space tends to be. And in the blockbuster game space and the mobile game space in general, profit and income are considered slightly higher priorities than in the indie game space, and artistry is considered a slightly less. And that's on average. That's a huge sweeping statement, but I mean, if we take a look at the average kind of highly successful blockbuster game and the average highly successful indie game, there's a pretty significant difference there in terms of the kind of artistry and the creativity being deployed there in most cases.
Sure.
In most cases.
So I was going to ask about what was driving the gamblification of games. So obviously one answer here is money,
money,
right?
and
so
corporate
so
culture.
is that it? Or corporate culture seeking money? Is that the idea?
Yeah. I think in a paper I published on this a few years back with Tom Brock called "The Gambling Turn in Game Monetization," one thing we talked about there was kind of the difference between wanting to make games but make enough money that you can do that as a job, versus wanting to make money and wanting to do that via making games. Those are two very different thought processes, and the former is far more prevalent in the indie game space, the latter far more in the blockbuster and the mobile game space.
Right. And this is all have to do with how do you generate interest in the people who finance things, right? Because the people who finance things don't care what you're making. Not really.
Yes, exactly. If you're in charge of a company and EA's bought you and you employ 200 people, EA isn't particularly concerned if you make a supremely creative, artistic game which pushes the edge of what creative media are. They couldn't care less about that, of course. I mean, it's EA. They care about making money for their CEOs and so on. So
that's right. And if you're a startup company trying to get venture capital, they want you to turn around in 3 years and pay them 10 times what they put in.
I won't name specific ones, but there's a few known cases of companies who were kind of indie in air quotes, and then they got a lot of cash from these sorts of sources, and then their thought processes and their creative practice shifted quite noticeably after that happened as well. Yeah, so in terms of corporate culture, in blockbuster games and in mobile games in the last kind of 10 years, we've seen an increasing corporatization of these parts of the game sector, in terms of the volume of money, in terms of the focus on profit over creativity, in terms of and also I guess in terms of sort of these parts of the game sector becoming increasingly distinct industrial sectors with their own sets of norms and practices and kind of dynamics and internal politics and these sorts of things. We've seen this all intensify in the last kind of 10 to 15 years-ish. And those shifts, coupled with the ability of online storefronts and NFTs and all these sorts of things to continually generate profit, these have happened at the same time and have fed into each other. I think a really great example of this was when Fallout 76 came out and was an unplayable piece of crap, which was in essence just built to get microtransactions flowing through and so on. There was an interview with Todd Howard, I think his name is, the Bethesda lead dev or CEO or whatever his rank is, and when he was interviewed about why they'd gone with these sorts of models, he was talking about Skyrim, I think, and he said, the issue with that is we put this game out 10 years back and people love it and people still play it and make mods for it and so on, and that's all great, but he then said, but we know we no longer have any way to touch base with those players, unquote. And what he meant was continue to extract money from them. Because they've got plenty of ways to touch base with players. Like they can just look at what people are doing in Skyrim, or people can tweet at them, hey, I made a cool mod in Skyrim. What he meant is we can no longer continue to extract value from these players because Skyrim was a one-off purchase. You buy it, you own it, you then play it. And I think that quote, I wish the interviewer had kind of said, Todd, what exactly do you mean by this? This is a kind of intriguing quote you've just said. But I think that quote unintentionally is very, very telling about this kind of, about how this sort of corporate language about engagement or touching base with players and so on, it all just masks what they really mean, which is just, we want to keep making money, we want to keep players buying crap in general in our games, basically.
So let me ask. So, okay, obviously this is where microtransactions themselves, right, are coming in. But, you know, microtransactions also, and free-to-play also has benefits for gaming. And when I'm thinking for gamers, right, and when I think of gambling, I mean, right, you played online poker, right? Lots of people love to gamble every so often.
Yes, although I would say that poker is different because it's a skill game, but I would say that. But I do think that there's a distinction there.
Though, you know, my sister lives in Vegas. I go to Vegas all the time, and I see people, you know, playing slot machines all the time.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you know, people do, and again, sports gambling, most of it is like, you know, $100 on my team.
Yeah.
Right?
Do we want to make the difference between gambling and problem gambling?
Can we before we get there? Because I want to get there. Because I think it's really important. But before we get there, companies found a way that they can make even more money if you attach, let's say, microtransaction to gambling, or if you add gambling elements. But are they the only ones that are getting something, or is this a new layer of fun that players also get?
Oh yeah. Like, I'm not a kind of anti-gambling person at all. I think for most people, it's a harmless hobby, just like spending $100 on some other thing which you don't get back. It's spending money for some experience, for some kind of experience, and that's fine. Yeah, I mean, I don't think we want to fall into that trap of treating anyone who's ever wagered on anything as some kind of clueless dupe. I don't think that's a very good trap to fall into. I think it's kind of patronizing and insulting to people because most people know, like, I'm not going to make a full-time living from this. I don't intend to make a full-time living from this. I just enjoy watching sports or watching esports or playing a game, and I don't mind spending X money to do Y in this game, and that's fine. But, so I don't think we should downplay what some players are getting out of this, and one of the arguments which is often articulated here is this idea that if a player is cash rich and time poor, which is another way of saying if they are an adult, then they should be allowed to spend money to advance in that game rather than playing that game. So if the game might take 40 hours for you to unlock every skin, or you can pay a bit of money to unlock those skins, then the argument is that's a player empowering choice to make those options. And that argument is not completely nothing, but I think it overlooks a number of points. I think it overlooks, A, that these systems are in general, like I say, you can't design a game with microtransaction or gambling or gamblified monetization methods without that shaping how the game is built. As in, these games are not kind of... It's not like you have a finished game and then you add gamblified transactions on top of it. It's that from the ground up, these games are built with these in mind. So even if it does take 40 hours to unlock X, or you can just buy X, the developers made it so that it takes 40 hours to unlock X, so that you think, sod this, I'll just pay some money to unlock X. So although on one level, this kind of time cash argument has something to it, I don't think it has that much to it because these games are built with the intention of making the player think about things in terms of a time cash trade-off.
Right.
And also, of course, a lot of these games are built to be extremely grindy in order to discourage players from putting in those hours. As if the point of playing the game is to enjoy playing the game, surely you want to put in 40 hours because it's fun and you're enjoying that game. Whereas I think one might argue, and I would, if the player ever thinks, I can't be bothered to play this game for 40 hours to get the thing I want, then you should think, well, does that maybe imply the game is really not that worth playing and maybe not that good to be worth that time investment on your part?
Though notice, right? This is the argument about these kinds of microtransactions, specific type of microtransactions in general. But notice about even if you're like, okay, fuck it, I'm just gonna get that thing. Do I get something extra by, getting to gamble for it, or am I forced at this point to kind of I can't even get it, I gotta gamble for it?
I think you are encouraged. Forced, I think, would be relatively rare, though some games do definitely have items one can only get through loot boxes and these sorts of things. But I think encouraged without a doubt, but the extent on the kind of optional, encouraged, forced spectrum, I think where something falls on that is partly down to the game's design, but also I think we must inevitably say down to the player, also down to their psychology, down to how they think about time and money and these sorts of trade-offs. I think a different person in a different game will always fall on a different end of that spectrum, I think.
To go back to what Andy said earlier about problematic gamblers, right? Gambling can be fun, but obviously gambling can also be dangerous, right? Lots of people have serious concerns about the dangers of gambling. We have lots and lots of laws about gambling all over the world. This is a very, very heavily regulated field in most countries. And all of a sudden, it's in, games which are barely regulated in any ways. So rather than focus necessarily on the regulations, so we maybe should talk about that too, if whatever you think about that. But what are some of the dangers that might come around for players if as games become more gamblified? And do you see the increased gamification of video games as kind of duplicating the dangers you have in gambling?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big kind of moral panic so far has been that young people would play these sorts of games and would be gambling within these games, and that's definitely one which merits attention. I mean, it's way easier to buy a loot box in a MOBA than it is to sign up to a poker site and play poker, or to sign up to a slot site and play slots. If you are below the age of 18, it's way easier to do the first of those than to do the latter of those.
Why is that, by the way? Is there an age verification in the poker sites?
Poker sites and slot sites tend to be extremely strict on this because they know they have to, because as you say, there's a planet's worth of laws on this. Back in my day, I think you just had to... I don't remember what the age verification thing was. Maybe you just had to have a card, and the assumption was that you wouldn't have a card unless you're 18 or over. But I think that there was something further. Maybe it was a passport you had to upload. Truthfully, I mean, this was 14 years ago now. I don't remember exactly how I proved I was 18, but I did in some way. Whereas games don't have any of that sort of stuff, and there's a bunch of reasons for that. In part because games games with gambling systems are quite new, so the legal framework for them isn't really in place yet. Coupled with the fact that legislators are far more aware of online slot sites than mobile games, which have these sorts of systems, combined with, of course, to be kind of hard and cynical about it, games companies have no particular financial inclination to be strict on these things. And I realize that's a very kind of cynical appraisal of what these companies are thinking, but all the evidence suggests that I'm not being kind of unfair to them.
No, I think that's pretty accurate.
Yeah, so I think a combination of those things means that it's pretty easy if you're below the age of 18, well, fairly, to buy a loot box for real world money. It's extremely hard to get onto a slot site, a poker site, these sorts of things. So this concern about young people will get into gambling by doing these things. It's worth thinking about. I also think it's overblown, though. It's overblown because games are the kind of classic site of mall panic in the last 50 years. And this is not the first. It won't be the last, without a doubt. There's definitely some kind of echoes of the previous game mall panics, which we can see reflected in this one. So it's a concern. It's not a kind of cataclysmic world-ending concern, as some people seem to be implying, but it's definitely a concern and a question, and one which kind of makes us think about games, about gameplay, about game designer, about game companies, about game players. Though I think another kind of aspect of this is in the watching of people gambling on games rather than doing it oneself, because as we talked about, like on YouTube and Twitch and so on, you can watch people who open loot boxes or watch people who do skin betting websites, and often, of course, these people will be playing at higher stakes, whatever that means, than the average player. As you can watch people, for instance, who might be doing skin betting for hundreds of thousands of dollars rather than for hundreds, full stop.
Right.
And I think there's also a question about who's watching these. Is that encouraging? Is that making these things seem exciting and thrilling? And kind of because gameplay and gaming culture, especially for kind of celebrity players, is so public these days, I think that complicates matters as well beyond just players playing these things. I think players watching other players playing these things is also something to think about, as it's very hard to go and watch someone playing slots in the real world. I mean, it's very, very easy to go and watch someone who's opening loot boxes.
Right.
Okay.
That's fascinating. Yeah.
Never thought about that at all. To be honest,
I am hoping to get a grant to research that in the near future. So any gambling grant bodies who are watching this, keep me in mind, please.
One thing about traditional gambling is that the odds are known. I mean, even even pretty remedial players of, let's say, we're playing roulette. Are aware of what the odds are. Is there a dramatic difference between the kind of odds that you can get gambling, traditional gambling, and the kinds of odds you get in gaming?
I think it depends on what exactly you're doing in terms of the gaming gambling stuff. Like, if you're doing skin betting on a virtual roulette wheel, then it's the same as in an in-person one, assuming the site is fair, of course, which is another thing to keep in mind. But,
Right.
Can we go back to that, assuming the site is fair, right? Because if you're doing it in an actual professional gambling site,
you would expect the odds to be fair, and like a lot of sites have very kind of complex verification systems and these sorts of things now for how the odds are created, for how their random numbers are created, and so on.
I'm assuming you can't just do a roulette site, like, again, traditional gambling roulette site, without some serious legal oversight, or can you?
You can, but you might get in trouble.
Okay.
So for the gaming gambling sites, I mean, a lot of these are still kind of grey markety type things now. So when you're playing them, you are tacitly assuming or expecting or hoping the degree of trust, or whatever we call it, on this site is equivalent to if I was playing on PokerStars or if I was playing on whatever.
Or playing in real life.
Yes, exactly. And again, there's always a sliding scale where if you go to a massive casino in Vegas, which has been established for 100 years, you can be as confident as any human can be, which is not to say 100, but as confident as any human can be that every game is on the level, every game does what it's meant to do, every spin plays out how it should, the dice are not loaded, and all these sorts of things.
So, and we can tell you that that's actually not true. Well, the casinos have to, in aggregate, pay out X amount.
Oh, yeah.
But they don't have to pay out X amount for every machine.
Yes, yeah.
So they can hide their well-paying machines and put their poorly paying machines in heavily trafficked areas.
I see.
And this is common.
Yes. Though, even those machines would still, if audited, have to give a truthful accounting of how much they pay out. Yeah.
That's right. But you don't have to tell the player.
Yeah. So, loot boxes, I think, are the intriguing case of this, where, of course, in most cases, they don't give the odds. In most cases,
at all.
There was a lot of debate about this, of course, a few years back in 2018, 2019, 2020-ish, about should they be giving out odds, and if so, does this make people less likely to buy them, or less likely to buy them in a potentially addictive manner.
Was there not an agreement that was made on this that was supposed to be implemented?
Some countries did this. I think China made a big push on this. I think some European countries, maybe Belgium and the Netherlands, made a big push on this. I think one of them, I'd have to go and check which. I think it might have been Belgium, made it legally binding that every single loot box ever sold to a player in that country must show the odds. I think it was Belgium. It might not have been, but I think it was. So I think the jury's still out on to what extent those change things, but I think because I guess the question is, are the odds the main reason someone's playing? And in most cases, I'd say the answer is no. As you said,
right.
And the kind of, if you're playing this just for you enjoy watching your sports team, you want to bet $50 on them, that's not a kind of rational mathematical assessment of will I make profit from this. It's part of that culture, it's part of the fun, it's part of the whatever. So the idea that showing odds on loot boxes is crucial is kind of predicated on this tacit idea that when someone buys a loot box, it's purely the odds which they are thinking about. And that's probably not actually the case, I think.
Right.
But there still seems to be a really big difference between those two things, right? If I'm betting on my favorite esport team, right, it's my team, it's part of the fun of the match. With the loot box, I'm specifically paying for it to get something. Right? I mean,
yes.
You know, it's not like the bet is a side, is just a side benefit of this, of the enjoyment of the match. It's more like the bet is what I'm trying to accomplish. I'm trying to win.
Right, but the loot box. So here's how I approach loot boxes as a player. As a player, I approach a loot box as, I'm in two ways. One is, a loot box. I wonder what I get. I might get something cool. I might not get something cool. I might get something super common. And then the other way is, I'm trying to collect these things. I need to get this one. Here's a loot box. What are my odds? And in that case, I need to know. I need to track this, and I would like to know. In the first case, I don't really care, but in the second case, I really, really care.
I think that's right, but I think that there's another aspect beyond this kind of do I care / am I specifically trying to get a thing, which is the pleasure of the uncertainty and the pleasure of the kind of exciting aspects of doing the loot box by itself. Like 5 years back, I put out a book called The Unpredictability of Gameplay, where I talked a lot about the kind of enjoyment of not knowing what's going to happen in a game. And part of this, I think, applies to loot boxes, in that loot boxes are made to be very exciting to open. They'll have kind of flashy graphics, and there'll be sounds, and there'll be explosions, and the loot box explodes, and things fly out, and so on.
There's all this sensory pleasure that you get with it as well.
Exactly.
Yes.
And that, I think, is an important aspect, because the loot box, or the loot box type thing, whatever it might be, is presented as being thrilling, as being noteworthy, and there's a certain amount of kind of dramatic tension between when you click open and when you see what the items are. That could be 5 or even 10 seconds. And there's an exciting tension there. I think it's also worth keeping in mind that there's also aspects of existing games which we also see in loot boxes. Like if you're playing a non-loot box RPG and you find a chest, you then maybe the contents of that chest are randomly selected, and you open it and you get something. So getting rewards where you don't know what the reward is prior, irrespective of the real world financial part, that first part is just well known to gamers. It's just fun. Yeah. So loot boxes do to some extent kind of play off and trade off that aspect also, that this is something gamers are used to. We are used to acquiring some unknown set of items, and we are used to that acquisition being exciting, having some kind of tension to it. And combining those with these little real money transactions is what makes something like loot boxes so successful. But I don't think we can fully explain why people buy loot boxes with just the I'm seeking an item, or I'm intrigued to see what happens. I think the third aspect of the pleasure of the opening itself, I think, is also something to keep in mind. Yeah.
No, that's a very good point. In some ways, it's like gotcha machines. Shlomo, I don't know if it's a term that came out of, I think, Japanese arcades, but it's basically, the capsule machines. We had them in our grocery stores growing up, right? You put a quarter in, you turn the knob, it provides a capsule. The capsule has one of 15 different toys in it. It's that. And we look at that and we're like, that's perfect for kids.
Sure, for a quarter.
For a quarter.
Right, for a quarter. And it's interesting how much, the more, so when EA said, there's nothing wrong with these, are surprise mechanics. People love surprises, right? And what you're saying is that there is some truth to that. But maybe the more money involved, the more we kind of got away the benefit of that versus the potential downside.
Exactly. I think kind of taken in a vacuum, and if we remove the absurd phrasing, the pure statement of surprise is enjoyable in games, that's true without a doubt. But then when you have all these other design and financial aspects, of course, that makes it a lot more complex than their very disingenuous statement about surprise mechanics. Yeah.
Right.
And to be fair, those things that we got out of the capsules that are for a quarter are not worth anything. Right. You couldn't, they're not resellable. There's no resale market for those things. They don't have any value. The value is 25 cents to open a capsule and see what you get.
Can I just say, I have a 9-year-old, right? And, when we go to arcades and when you get those tickets in arcades, that's also a sort of gamblification. And I've noticed that arcades have become so much more focused on getting those tickets, which are, and a lot of those, there's a spin the big wheel in the arcade, and tons of just purely luck-based where kids are betting for tickets. And that's become, and even the skill games, and the skill games at least are better, but at the end of the day, you're getting crap. All right, you're turning in your tickets for crap but it feels good, and it hooks into that psychological part of you that makes you want to get as many tickets as possible and feel like you got something, even though it just ends up being on the floor in the car left at home.
I feel like all of this sort of stuff does, as you're kind of saying, need to be seen on this spectrum, that some things are more gambly than others, some things are less. And for reasons of policy, we tend to make gambling into this one thing where either something is or isn't, and then we legislate on things based on that. And also just kind of humans in general like to categorize things and to kind of delineate things and to make typologies of things, because ambiguity or grayness or kind of mid or kind of middle of the spectrum stuff is far more complex and far harder to deal with than clear black and white, X and Y, up and down type things.
That's right.
Especially for laws.
Yes, exactly. Whereas in truth, you could create a whole spectrum of things which are more or less gamblified than others, and as you note, many of those would be things we consider to be fine for children to do and to play with.
Skee ball. I mean, right? Skee ball, right? It's the last thing you think of when you think of gambling. Mark, where do you see this going? Right. So we have this current trend. I'm assuming that this current trend appeared because it appeared when people figured out that it could be done, right? And now that they figured out it could be done, where do you think we're going with it?
Yeah. So kind of we had this confluence of corporate factors, design factors, and technological factors which linked up to make all this stuff happen. And then we had the big backlash in kind of 2018, 2019, 2020-ish. Obviously, in the last 2 years, I think people have been a bit distracted by some other stuff, but we definitely had that backlash. And now I think a lot of game developers are being far less shameless in their use of loot boxes and things of this sort, and some skin betting sites and so on have been clamped down on a little bit or have been regulated a bit. In terms of where it's going, I think there's a number of aspects here. I think we can definitely confidently assert that it won't be spreading into indie games. And if I'm wrong about this, I'm happy to be on the record being wrong on this, but I don't think I am. I think we will continue to see that, and indie games is a huge part of games, of course, these days. I feel extremely confident in saying these mechanics will basically never spread into indie games. I think the cultural and the creative motives against that are just so strong. I think every now and then we'll see a struggling indie company who transitions into these game types and starts doing something else, but I think that's extremely rare. I think in blockbuster mobile games, I think we will continue to see companies trying to innovate and find new ways to use these sorts of systems. I think loot boxes are still used, but I think even the clueless, ultra-rich freaks who run a lot of these games companies, I think even they now, when they're done kind of sitting in their Scrooge McDuck bathtub of money, I think even they perceive, insofar as they make sense of kind of any aspect of human life, I think even they perceive that loot boxes are seen as a bit iffy, a bit dodgy now, and maybe we need to change how these are done, or maybe these should be cosmetic only, or that type of thing. But I think in things like battle passes, we see, and like my work and other people's work has talked about this kind of constant innovation, this constant change of what new methods can we find which are compelling to players, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is a side issue, but techniques which are compelling to players, techniques which are not yet illegal, techniques which are kind of discursively or culturally considered acceptable or at least not awful. And this kind of constant change and these constant updates, I think that's the big thing we should expect to see in the next 10 years. All these new kinds of combinations and constellations of design and technological factors continue to keep extracting money through these kinds of gambling or gamblified or semi-gambling methods, while still trying to dodge legal constraints, dodge cultural constraints, and so on. I think that's the big thing we'll see. I think also I think there must come a point where more legal attention will be paid. I don't think we've reached that yet, but it must happen at some point, I think. I'm not sure when or why that will take place, because a part of me thinks if it hasn't happened yet with the absurd stuff that we've already seen, then will it happen at all? But I think it must at some point. I think we will see kind of a second wave of very strong legal attention at some point in the future. But I think that also comes down to how shameless are these big games companies going to become? And past evidence shows the answer is extraordinarily shameless. So I think when they do something else in the near future, which is just absolutely mind-bogglingly absurd, I think when that thing happens, whatever that thing is, and I don't know it and no one does yet, but when that thing happens, I think we'll see a second wave of really strong attention being paid to these sorts of systems. And then, in terms of players, I think we will see more players becoming keen on these blurred lines, on these kind of middle ground gaming gambling stuff. But at the same time, in games like Battlefront 2, there have been such strong backlashes as well from players. So, yeah, I think those are the three big headlines. I think these sorts of methods will stay in blockbuster and mobile games and not transition into indie games. These companies will increasingly try all these new models, will be constantly changing, constantly trying to find new stuff. I think we will see a second wave of legal attention and interest, and I think players is the least easy to predict of these four factors. I think the jury's kind of out on the one hand, loads of people engage with these, because if they didn't, then they wouldn't make money. On the other hand, loads of players hate these things with a passion. So where players are going on gaming gambling, I think, is more complex and hard to say.
Right. It's like hate these things with a passion, but we'll do it anyway because that's the option we have.
Some will, yeah.
The only game in town.
Exactly.
Yes.
You know, it's interesting, Mark. By the way, our next episode is going to be with Leon Zhao about essentially what he thinks is the failure of laws to work at all regulating loot boxes. I feel like we're well prepared now for that one. And I'm very curious to see where that goes. All right. So, Mark, what do you want to leave people with?
So I think the main takeaways from this are that gaming gambling is a spectrum rather than a hard cutoff. There's a lot of complexity here and a lot of different phenomena which we should be paying attention to. I think also part of the takeaway is that a lot of this comes down to games companies and these broader corporate shifts in the kind of big money game sector towards profit making as an absolute imperative above creative or artistic issues. And I think the final takeaway is that these things do merit our concern, but they are so new and they are so rapidly changing that the full kind of level of how concerned we should be is bizarrely kind of not clear yet. Whether these are huge world-changing shifts in games and gaming we are seeing taking place, or whether these might stay comparatively not small but not huge parts of gaming, whether they might stay kind of within a certain bracket of gaming and not go beyond that also might be true. It's just very early days right now and quite hard to tell on some level.
All right. Mark Johnson, thank you for joining us today. That was fantastic.
Thanks so much, guys. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Good podcast, GP. Play nice, everybody.
You can subscribe and listen to all of our episodes wherever you listen to podcasts.